After offering to drive them to the airport, I asked for gas money. My daughter-in-law laughed and said, "You're not Uber, you're a burden." My son said, "Don't ruin this trip." They took off, but didn't know that their vacation would be interrupted by a notification that said their return address had been. I've always believed that stability is something you build quietly, brick by brick, without asking for recognition. You show up, you do your part, and over time, your life settles into something steady. That's what I had. Nothing flashy, nothing remarkable, but solid. I lived in a modest 2-story house in a quiet suburb just outside Columbus, Ohio. It wasn't new, but it was mine. I'd bought it 23 years ago with my late husband, Daniel. After he passed, I stayed, not because I couldn't move on, but because this house had already held everything worth remembering. By the time this story begins, I was 62, retired from my job as a payroll supervisor for a mid-sized logistics company. My days were predictable: morning coffee on the porch, a bit of gardening, occasional lunches with neighbors. I liked it that way. My son, Eric, lived about 30 minutes away with his wife, Melissa. They'd been married for 5 years. No kids yet, something Melissa always framed as intentional, though I got the sense it had more to do with priorities than timing. Eric had always been a good kid. Quiet, thoughtful, a little too eager to keep the peace. After Daniel died, Eric stepped up in ways I hadn't asked for but appreciated. He checked in, helped around the house, made sure I wasn't alone too often. Things changed after he married Melissa. Melissa was efficient, that's the kindest word I can use. She had a way of treating relationships like transactions, everything weighed, measured, and evaluated for its usefulness. She wasn't rude on the surface. In fact, if you met her once, you'd probably call her charming. But over time, the pattern revealed itself. Every favor had a cost. Every visit had a purpose. Every conversation somehow circled back to what she needed next. I learned early on not to expect warmth from her. Respect would have been enough, but even that came in short supply. Still, I kept things smooth, for Eric's sake. They visited occasionally, holidays, birthdays, the usual obligations. When they did, I cooked, I cleaned. I made sure everything felt welcoming. Melissa would compliment the food in that clipped, polite way that sounded more like an evaluation than appreciation. "Not bad," she'd say, as if she were grading me. Eric never noticed, or maybe he did and chose not to. Over the years, small things started to pile up. Melissa would borrow items and forget to return them. She once asked me to watch their dog for a week, then extended it to 3 without asking. Another time, she had me help organize a garage sale, only to keep every dollar and casually say, "Well, it was mostly our stuff anyway." I let it go every time. Not because I didn't notice, but because I believed keeping peace in the family mattered more than being right. That belief lasted longer than it should have. The week before everything changed started like any other. Eric called me on a Tuesday evening. "Hey Mom," he said, his voice distracted. "Quick favor." I smiled even though he couldn't see it. "Of course. We've got an early flight Saturday morning, like really early, 5 a.m. boarding. Would you be able to drive us to the airport?" It was about an hour away, not ideal but manageable. "Sure," I said. "What time would you need to leave?" "Probably around 3. I paused for half a second, not long enough to sound hesitant. "All right, I'll be there." "Thanks, Mom, I appreciate it." Melissa's voice cut in faintly from the background. "Tell her not to be late this time." I ignored it. "Just text me the details," I said. "Will do." We hung up. I stared at my phone for a moment longer than necessary. 3 a.m. was early, but this is what family does, I reminded myself. They help each other. Saturday came quickly. I woke up at 2:15 a.m., got dressed, and drove through the quiet, empty streets to their house. The world felt still in that way it only does before sunrise, like everything was holding its breath. When I pulled into their driveway, their porch light was already on. Melissa opened the door before I even knocked. "You're here," she said, glancing at her phone. "Good, we're on a tight schedule." No greeting, no thank you. Just timing. Eric came down the stairs, carrying 2 suitcases. "Morning, Mom," he said, offering a quick smile. I returned it, "Morning." We loaded the car in silence. As I started the engine, Melissa slid into the back seat and immediately began scrolling through her phone. Eric sat in the passenger seat, adjusting the GPS even though I knew the route by heart. The drive began like most things in my life at that point, quiet, predictable, and slightly uncomfortable. But that morning, something small shifted. Not yet obvious. Not yet loud. Just enough to change everything that came after. The road to the airport stretched out in front of us, empty and dark, lit only by the occasional street lamp and the soft glow of my dashboard. I'd made this drive dozens of times over the years, for work trips, family visits, even picking up Eric when he came home from college. It used to feel routine. That morning, it felt different. Not because of the drive itself, but because of the silence inside the car. Eric kept glancing at his phone, likely checking flight updates. Melissa sat in the back, legs crossed, typing rapidly, the faint tapping of her nails against the screen filling the quiet. I focused on the road. About 20 minutes in, I spoke, keeping my tone light. How long is the trip again? 10 days, Eric said, all-inclusive resort. Melissa chimed in without looking up. Finally, we deserve this. I nodded even though she couldn't see me. Sounds nice. Another stretch of silence. Then I cleared my throat slightly. Hey, just one small thing. Eric turned his head a little. Yeah. I was wondering if you could help out with gas for the drive. Prices have been a bit high lately, and with the distance. I kept my voice calm, matter of fact, not demanding, just practical. Eric hesitated. Just for a second. But that second told me everything. Before he could respond, Melissa let out a short laugh from the back seat. Not amused. Dismissive. Oh my God, she said, shaking her head. Are you serious right now? I blinked, keeping my eyes on the road. It's just for gas. It's a 2-hour round trip. She leaned forward slightly, her voice sharper now. You're not Uber. I didn't answer right away. Then she added with a small, cold chuckle, you're a burden. The word landed heavier than I expected. It's not loud, not dramatic, just precise. Like she'd been waiting to say it. Eric shifted in his seat. Melissa. But she cut him off. What? It's true. Every time we ask for something, there's always something attached. It's exhausting. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, my knuckles whitening just slightly. That's not true, I said quietly. Melissa scoffed. Really? Because this feels pretty transactional to me. Eric finally spoke, his voice lower, strained. Mom, can we just not do this right now? I glanced at him briefly. Do what? Make things awkward, he said. It's early, we're tired, we've got a flight to catch. Just don't ruin this trip over something small. Don't ruin this trip. I let those words sit in the silence that followed. The road stretched on. Empty. Still. I nodded once, you're right. Neither of them responded. I didn't bring it up again. For the rest of the drive, Melissa went back to her phone like nothing had happened. Eric stared out the window, occasionally shifting, but saying nothing more. And me. I drove. Calm. Steady. Exactly like I always had. But something inside me had shifted. Not cracked. Not broken. Just adjusted. Like a lock clicking into place. We reached the airport just before 4:15 a.m. The drop-off lane was already busy, with cars unloading luggage and sleepy travelers rushing toward the entrance. I pulled over near the curb. Eric unbuckled his seatbelt quickly. All right, we're here. I popped the trunk. He got out and started unloading the suitcases. Melissa stepped out without a word, already adjusting her sunglasses even though the sun wasn't up yet. I stayed in the driver's seat. Not moving. Not rushing. Just watching. Eric closed the trunk and leaned down toward my window. Thanks for the ride, Mom. I looked at him for a moment. There was something in his expression, guilt maybe, or just discomfort. Either way, it wasn't enough. You're welcome, I said. Melissa didn't come over to say goodbye. She was already walking toward the entrance. Eric hesitated, then gave me a quick nod before following her. And just like that, they were gone. No apology. No acknowledgement. No gas money. Just silence and that one word echoing quietly in my mind. Burden. I sat there for a moment longer than necessary. Cars honked behind me, urging me to move. I pulled away from the curb and merged back into traffic. The drive home felt longer. Not because of distance, but because of clarity. By the time I reached my driveway, the sun was just beginning to rise, casting a pale light over the quiet neighborhood. I turned off the engine and sat there, hands resting lightly on the wheel. For years, I had told myself that keeping the peace was the right choice. That letting things go made me the bigger person. That patience would eventually be met with respect. But respect doesn't grow where it isn't planted. And that morning, I realized something simple. I hadn't been keeping the peace. I had been maintaining their comfort. At my expense. I stepped out of the car and walked toward the front door. The house was quiet. Still, mine. As I set my keys down on the kitchen counter, my eyes drifted toward the hallway. Toward the guest room. The room Eric and Melissa used whenever they stayed over. Their things were still there. A few pieces of luggage they'd dropped off earlier in the week. Clothes hanging in the closet. Shoes near the door. They had plans to come back. To walk in like nothing had happened. To resume everything exactly as it was. I stood there for a long moment. Then I smiled. Not out of anger. Not out of spite. But because, for the first time in years, I saw the situation clearly. And clarity changes everything. The house was unusually quiet after they left. The kind of quiet that makes you notice things you've been ignoring. The ticking of the kitchen clock, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the soft creak of the floorboards as I paced the living room. I kept thinking about Melissa's words, "You're a burden." That one line replayed in my head over and over. I could almost hear the clipped laughter. I could almost feel the cold, dismissive glance. And I realized something I had tried to ignore for years. It wasn't just a one-off moment of rudeness. It was the culmination of every slight, every borrowed item, every favor that had been repaid with nothing but obligation or scorn. At first I felt that familiar weight of hurt, the sinking feeling that comes from being undervalued by someone you care about, someone you've tried to support. I went through the motions of my morning routine, but nothing felt normal. The coffee didn't taste right. The sunlight spilling into the kitchen seemed harsher, almost accusatory. I couldn't sit still. By mid-morning, the hurt started to morph into something else, a simmering sense of injustice. I replayed the drive in my mind, every flick of Melissa's hand, every word from her lips, every glance from Eric that said, "Don't ruin this trip." First, I blamed myself. Had I been too forward about asking for gas money? Had I overstepped? But no, the more I thought about it, the more I realized the truth. They had crossed a line. They had humiliated me, publicly, quietly, efficiently. I spent the next few hours going through their things. Not out of malice, but out of habit, small things I had done for them over the years. Laundry I'd folded and left in their drawers, toiletries I had bought for them without complaint, snacks they liked in the pantry. Everything seemed mine, or at least things I had provided. The realization was unsettling. I'd built a network of favors and kindness around them, only to be treated as disposable. I didn't know it yet, but that moment marked a turning point. I was no longer willing to let their behavior slide, no longer willing to be the invisible caretaker of their convenience. I felt a strange energy building inside me, a calm, deliberate sort of resolve. It wasn't anger in the explosive sense. It was the quiet, methodical understanding that the rules of our relationship had changed, whether they knew it or not. That afternoon, I started making lists. Not grocery lists, not to-do lists. No lists of things that mattered, things I could leverage. Small details about their routines, habits, travel schedules, flight numbers, addresses, email confirmations, credit card link notifications, vacation itineraries. I didn't act on anything yet. I just collected, observed, catalogued. By evening, I noticed an opportunity. A small, seemingly insignificant digital oversight they had left. A vacation confirmation email from the resort, sent to the return address associated with their home. They hadn't used a private email for their bookings. Everything came to a general inbox I had occasionally been allowed access to when helping with their trips in the past. Normally, I would have ignored it, but that day I didn't. That day I felt a subtle thrill at the thought of reclaiming some control, not to harm them physically, not to humiliate them in public. No, the satisfaction would be deeper, quieter, and precise. As the sun dipped behind the trees, casting long shadows across my living room, I leaned back in my chair and imagined their vacation. Beautiful beaches, endless buffets, and the blissful illusion that nothing had changed. I imagined them laughing, unaware that the first ripple of disruption was already forming. A single notification could change the course of their trip without a word from me. I thought of the sense of helplessness I'd felt when Melissa had called me a burden. How small it made me feel in front of my own son. That feeling would not return. Not now, not ever again. And in that quiet, deliberate evening, I made my first conscious decision. They would learn that their comfort had limits, that their dismissiveness had consequences, and that their carefully constructed bubble of superiority and entitlement could be punctured by something as subtle as a single digital alert. I went to bed that night with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. A plan was beginning to form, slowly, meticulously, like the turning of a safe dial. Every step had to be calculated, every move precise. Revenge, I realized, wasn't about emotion. It was about strategy, and this was going to be perfect. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of calm clarity that surprised me. For years, I had carried around the quiet weight of being overlooked, dismissed, and undervalued by Melissa, and by extension, Eric. But that morning, I realized that weight wasn't mine to carry anymore. It had been theirs, in a way. Their thoughtlessness, their entitlement, their casual cruelty. Those were the things that had accumulated over the years, not my shortcomings. And now I had a way to redirect it, carefully and deliberately. I brewed my coffee slowly, savoring the warmth in my hands. The garden outside the window was beginning to wake with spring blooms, and for the first time in years, I felt a pulse of excitement I couldn't explain. Not because of revenge itself, but because I was reclaiming agency. I was no longer just reacting to Melissa's whims. I was planning, I was strategizing, I was awake. The first step was observation. I needed information, accurate, complete, and actionable. I began with what I already had: their vacation itinerary, emails, and notifications. Melissa had booked a 10-day all-inclusive resort trip in Florida. Flights were early morning departures. They had scheduled activities, car rentals, and even spa appointments. Most of these confirmations came through an email address I had previously been allowed access to for family coordination, which they assumed I no longer monitored. Their confidence in my complacency was a critical mistake. Over the next few days, I began cataloging everything carefully. Flight times, hotel confirmations, dining reservations, excursion bookings. I cross-referenced their plans with maps, local services, and even social media check-ins they had made in past vacations. Every detail became a piece of the puzzle I could use to orchestrate a small, precise disruption, something that wouldn't harm them but would make them question their perfect, controlled world. While doing this, I also re-examined the past grievances that had accumulated. Melissa's dismissive comments, her unreturned favors, the way Eric had allowed her to treat me as disposable. Each one became fuel not for anger but for clarity. I realized that the pattern wasn't personal, it was systematic. And if it was systematic, it was predictable. And predictability could be exploited. By the end of the week, I had a plan taking shape. I wouldn't interfere physically, nor would I do anything that could be traced directly to me in a way that would cause legal issues. My aim was psychological precision, a disruption that would frustrate them, shake their expectations, and leave them reeling in a controlled, harmless way. I also took a long look at myself. For years, I had allowed their behavior to define my own boundaries, my own sense of self-worth. That ended now. This awakening wasn't just about them, it was about me. Reclaiming control, setting limits, and understanding the power of patience. Revenge without patience is chaos. Patience without strategy is wasted energy. I had both now. I rehearsed mentally how I would execute the first move. It was simple, a notification, a single email alert that would be perfectly timed, perfectly worded, and perfectly indirect. They wouldn't know who did it, they wouldn't know it came from me, and yet it would disrupt their carefully curated vacation rhythm. It would make them confront the unexpected. It would plant doubt. As I prepared mentally, I also began small, deliberate actions in my daily life to reinforce my confidence. I organized my files, backed up important emails, and even revisited basic digital security principles to ensure they couldn't trace anything back to me. I created a sense of readiness, a calm competence that made every small decision deliberate. By the end of the week, I had fully internalized the mindset I needed. I was no longer the accommodating mother-in-law who silently absorbed disrespect. I was alert, deliberate, and strategically empowered. Each movement in my daily routine became part of the rehearsal, checking emails, monitoring notifications, timing interactions. And then one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the house was bathed in amber light, I realized something profound. I was no longer plotting revenge out of anger. I was executing justice out of precision. Melissa and Eric had underestimated me for years, not maliciously perhaps, but confidently. That confidence was their vulnerability, and I intended to exploit it. I sat in my favorite chair, sipping my tea, and allowed myself a quiet, almost meditative smile. For the first time in years, I felt fully alive, not in the chaos of emotion, but in the calm certainty of control. I knew the next step would require patience, but patience was no longer passive. It was active, calculated, intentional. By the time their vacation began, I was ready. Every detail had been rehearsed mentally, every possible contingency accounted for. They thought they were leaving me behind, small, inconvenient, and irrelevant. But in reality, they were stepping directly into the first move of a carefully orchestrated plan that would make them reconsider every assumption about the control they had over their lives. Their vacation had begun, their blissful ignorance was complete, and the first ripple of disruption was already poised to reach them. Saturday morning arrived, bright and sunny, just as their plane touched down in Florida. I had already prepared the first move days before, carefully timing it to coincide with their arrival. By now I knew the routine almost instinctively. The early morning flight, the predictable coffee at the airport cafe, the brief exchange of sleepy grumbles and forced smiles, and then the blissful descent into vacation mode where they would believe the world revolved only around them. I logged into the email account they used for bookings, an account they thought I no longer monitored, and carefully drafted a single, seemingly innocuous email notification. It was simple, but perfectly disruptive. It stated that their return address had been flagged by the resort's security system for an administrative error. It didn't explain exactly what had happened, just that there was a problem with the paperwork associated with their stay, and that a confirmation would be required before the check-in process could be completed. I didn't send it immediately. Timing was everything. I watched the clock. I knew the moment their plane landed, they would likely be checking emails or the resort's app to confirm check-in. At precisely 10:17 a.m., I hit send. The notification was subtle enough to seem like a system-generated alert, vague enough not to be traced to a human, but specific enough to set their minds racing. I imagined them reading it. Melissa would immediately take control, scanning the details with sharp, precise efficiency, while Eric would oscillate between confusion and mild panic. They would assume it was a technical glitch. They would blame the resort. They would fume internally, trying to solve a problem they thought was external. But the truth was, the disruption had originated from someone they had long dismissed. By 10:45 a.m., I received a reply notification from the resort's customer service inbox. Melissa, in a panic, had already called. I didn't answer. I simply monitored the situation. They spent the next hour on hold navigating automated menus, trying to verify that their booking was intact. Every minute of waiting, every frustration, every tiny disruption, the suspense, the helplessness, it all fed the precise satisfaction of seeing their meticulous world crack, even if only for a moment. Meanwhile, I didn't act further. Patience was critical. The plan relied on small, accumulating disruptions. I wanted them to feel a sense of vulnerability without realizing its source. They couldn't retaliate against me directly. They didn't know I was involved. They couldn't accuse me, argue, or dismiss. They were trapped in their own assumptions. By late afternoon, Melissa had already escalated matters to the resort manager, while Eric tried to mediate, his calm voice no match for her efficiency-driven fury. They were tense, frayed at the edges, and uncomfortable in a way they had rarely experienced. No amount of luxury or all-inclusive comfort could counter the subtle anxiety creeping into their day. And then I added the next layer, a notification from their rental car company. The pickup time for their vehicle had been adjusted unexpectedly. Again, a vague alert. Attention, your return address on file is flagged. Immediate confirmation required. It wasn't a threat, it wasn't malicious. It was just enough to interrupt, to fracture their rhythm, to make them question every assumption about their vacation. Each alert compounded the previous one, layering frustration over inconvenience. By the evening, they had spent more time managing errors, holding calls, and verifying accounts than enjoying their beachside view or the promised spa appointments. Their carefully curated control, which they had assumed was unshakable, had begun to erode. I sat in my living room, quietly observing the unfolding chaos, feeling neither guilt nor malice, only precision satisfaction. Each move was calculated, each disruption perfectly timed, and the beauty of it lay in the subtlety. There were no confrontations, no public humiliation, no legal violations, just the quiet, inescapable consequences of underestimating someone who had been written off as a burden. By nightfall, I reviewed everything. Emails, notifications, call logs. They were fully engaged in problem-solving, entirely unaware that the source of the disruption was me. The power of invisibility was intoxicating. Melissa's tone, once sharp and dismissive toward me, now crackled with tension and urgency, her composure cracking under pressure. Eric, usually the mediator, seemed unsure, flustered, and entirely reactive. And that was exactly what I wanted. This was only the beginning. The first wave of disruption had been executed flawlessly. The next steps would require patience and adaptability, but the foundation was set. Their vacation, their supposed escape, had been infiltrated in a way that was precise, controlled, and invisible. They had underestimated me, they had laughed at me, they had dismissed me, and now they were learning, through confusion, tension, and subtle irritation, that their assumptions about control had been wrong from the start. The plan was working, quietly, methodically, and I hadn't even reached the first twist yet. By the third day of their vacation, the subtle disruptions I had orchestrated had begun to take their toll. Melissa was visibly on edge, moving through the resort with brisk efficiency, constantly checking her phone, repeatedly calling the front desk, and leaving Eric to mediate whenever something threatened to derail her schedule. He tried to maintain calm, but the tension radiating from her made him restless, irritable, and surprisingly ineffective. I observed from a distance, not literally of course, but through the carefully timed notifications and subtle digital nudges I had implemented. My goal was never to ruin the trip entirely. I wanted to implant doubt, frustration, and the uncomfortable sense of losing control. But as the day wore on, an unexpected development emerged, one that neither I nor they had anticipated. Around mid-afternoon, a reply came from the resort's manager, copied to an internal system that I had access to through prior coordination with Eric for family trips. The manager was concerned about the repeated notifications concerning the return address flag. Normally, such replies would go unnoticed, but this one was unusually detailed. Suggesting a possible system error at the booking platform itself, it read something like this. Dear guests, our system shows conflicting return addresses associated with your account. Please verify immediately to avoid check-in complications. It wasn't just a minor inconvenience anymore. Melissa, naturally skeptical of technology but controlling by instinct, assumed a major error had occurred and immediately escalated the matter to the corporate office. The twist was subtle. My harmless notifications, intended to frustrate, had accidentally triggered an internal review of their account. Within hours, the corporate office called. They were thorough, polite, but procedural. They wanted to verify personal information, travel dates, and crucially, the return address listed for billing and correspondence. Suddenly, Melissa's vacation, which had seemed meticulously planned and impenetrable, was interrupted by an official inquiry that demanded her attention and her compliance. The first wave of tension I had planned now took on an unpredictable edge. Melissa, convinced there was an actual problem with their booking, began to escalate her stress outward. She snapped at the resort staff, which in turn escalated Eric's anxiety. They had both become prisoners of the very system they trusted implicitly, a system I had gently nudged to awaken their vulnerability. By evening, I received indirect confirmation of my success. Eric called briefly, his voice subdued, trying not to anger Melissa further. Mom, we're dealing with some issues. Nothing big, just unexpected complications. Everything's fine though, just a lot of calls. I smiled quietly, savoring the precision of the disruption. But the first twist wasn't mine, it was theirs. They had reacted in ways I hadn't fully predicted. Melissa's stress levels skyrocketed because she assumed the problem was systemic, beyond her control, rather than understanding it was being manipulated externally. Eric's role as mediator collapsed under the pressure, leaving Melissa fully responsible for the perceived crisis. This twist forced me to adapt. I had intended a slow, calculated disruption, but the unexpected escalation offered new opportunities. The vacation, previously their sanctuary, was now partially compromised, but still under the guise of legitimate administrative concerns. I didn't need to act further to justify their stress. The system had done it for me. My careful planning had birthed unintended consequences, and I recognized the beauty of it. They were now entangled in a problem of their own making, unaware that the origin was someone they had dismissed. I leaned back in my chair that evening, reviewing my strategy. The first twist had shown me that control, even when exercised subtly, could spiral unpredictably, but in this case, unpredictability worked in my favor. They were now nervous, reactive, and deeply uncomfortable in ways I had only imagined. Their confidence in their vacation, their entitlement, their seamless assumption of control, all of it was cracking. By bedtime, Melissa had spent over 2 hours on the phone with the resort and corporate offices, demanding explanations and confirmations. Eric had grown exhausted trying to soothe her frustration while navigating the escalating administrative hurdles. And through it all, I remained invisible, calm, and entirely unchallenged. The first twist had revealed a critical insight. Perfectionism, entitlement, and dismissiveness could be weaponized, not through force, but through careful manipulation of expectations and assumptions. I realized that my revenge didn't need to be loud, confrontational, or vengeful in the conventional sense. It only needed to be inevitable, logical, and invisible. And now, with this new understanding, the stage was set for the turning point, the moment where they would begin to realize, too late, that their control had never been as complete as they believed. By the fourth day of their vacation, the cracks in Melissa and Eric's carefully curated world were no longer subtle. Their all-inclusive paradise, previously filled with sunlit beaches, perfectly timed excursions, and leisurely spa appointments, had become a maze of missed confirmations, repeated calls, and escalating stress. Every step they took seemed to bump into another unseen obstacle, a tiny disruption that chipped away at the illusion of control. Melissa, as expected, was the first to feel the weight of these interruptions. She had always thrived on control, meticulously planning schedules, dining reservations, and even the precise order of excursions each day. But now she found herself in a reactive position, constantly adjusting to circumstances she believed were beyond her influence. The notifications I had seeded, the flagged return address alerts, had multiplied in effect. By now, the resort had escalated the situation to the regional office, requesting formal verification of all bookings. Melissa was convinced this was a catastrophic administrative error. Eric, usually the calming mediator, was fraying at the edges. He had always deferred to her judgment, often attempting to smooth over conflicts before they escalated. But the constant barrage of interruptions and Melissa's sharp, impatient demands had stripped him of his usual confidence. He was exhausted, confused, and increasingly frustrated, not with me, of course, but with the vacation itself, and with his own inability to restore normalcy. The turning point came one afternoon when they attempted to board a scheduled excursion. The desk agent politely but firmly explained that the system had not yet received confirmation of their address and could not process certain activities. Melissa's composure cracked entirely. She demanded to speak with a supervisor. Eric tried to intercede, suggesting a calm, step-by-step approach. But the supervisor, following protocol, simply repeated what the system said. Their world, which had always run smoothly on their terms, now faltered in a way that was completely outside their control. That's when the realization began to dawn, slowly, painfully. Melissa began to suspect that the issues were not random. The alerts, the delays, the escalations, it was almost too precise. She muttered under her breath, frustrated and flustered, This can't all be a coincidence." Eric, sensing her anxiety, nodded reluctantly, though he lacked the courage to voice what was clearly forming in both their minds. The possibility that someone with intimate knowledge of their routines had influenced this chain of events. And that's when I struck the next layer of precision. I sent a subtle follow-up notification to the resort system, a confirmation alert showing that the return address discrepancy had been corrected, but only partially, leaving a minor mismatch in one of the records. It was enough to keep their tension alive, but not enough to fully resolve the issue. Melissa spent the next several hours obsessively reviewing emails, confirming addresses, and calling corporate offices for validation. Eric tried to mediate, but his attempts only highlighted the futility of their situation. By evening, their carefully constructed vacation world had unraveled. They were exhausted, anxious, and questioning everything they had assumed was under control. Melissa's tone had shifted from confident efficiency to brittle frustration, her sharpness now tinged with desperation. Eric's calm demeanor had become tentative, almost pleading, as he attempted to navigate her storm. The beauty of this turning point was psychological. Up to this point, they had assumed the disruptions were coincidental or technological errors. Now doubt had crept in. They had begun to recognize, subconsciously, that someone outside their immediate environment, someone who knew their habits intimately, was orchestrating these small but perfectly timed inconveniences. They did not yet know it was me, but the idea that they were vulnerable, that their control was fragile, had settled in firmly. And in that moment, I allowed myself a quiet, restrained smile. For years, I had been dismissed, belittled, and called a burden. I had remained calm, polite, and accommodating, but now the tables had shifted. The turning point was complete. Their belief in their own unassailable control had cracked, and they had no idea who or what was behind it. By nightfall, they sat in their resort room, exhausted and tense, sifting through emails and notifications. Melissa was muttering corrections to every booking, every alert, every system message. Eric, drained and frustrated, had given up trying to mediate, silently staring at the ceiling. The illusion of a perfect vacation had been shattered, and it was only the beginning. The stage was now set for the second twist, the moment when the consequences of their underestimation of me would deepen, revealing layers they could never have anticipated. By the fifth day of their vacation, Melissa and Eric were deeply entangled in what they perceived as a series of unprecedented administrative errors. Their stress had reached a tipping point. Every scheduled activity, every dining reservation, even basic resort services seemed to hinge on resolving this mysterious return address discrepancy. The tension was palpable, like a storm gathering quietly but inevitably on the horizon. Then came the second twist, one I had not fully anticipated when I began my plan, but which promised to magnify the impact of my subtle revenge exponentially. Around midday, I sent one final, carefully timed notification. Unlike the previous alerts, this one carried a tiny, almost inconspicuous detail that would push the disruption into a new dimension. The message stated that the resort had forwarded their information to the airline system as part of standard verification protocols. In essence, their return flight was now temporarily flagged for review because the registered address did not match the documentation on file. Melissa, reading the alert on her phone, immediately panicked. She was convinced this meant they could miss their flight home, a terrifying thought for someone who meticulously planned every detail. Eric, equally alarmed, tried to reassure her, but the anxiety had taken root too deeply. By late afternoon, the airline had indeed flagged their flight for verification, not because of any real issue, but because Melissa, in her frantic attempts to confirm information with the resort, had triggered a cascade of automated security checks. The second twist was complete. Their vacation, which had already been destabilized, now directly threatened their ability to leave on schedule. Melissa was beside herself, packing the hotel suite, muttering complaints about the system and incompetence, while Eric scrambled to contact both the resort and airline representatives to sort out what he now realized was a chain of seemingly unrelated errors. Both were fully consumed, fully stressed, and fully unaware that the origin of all this chaos traced back to the very person they had belittled and called a burden, me. The brilliance of this twist lay in its subtlety. I hadn't done anything illegal. I hadn't physically interfered. I had not yelled, threatened, or humiliated them in public. Everything unfolded naturally, logically, as a series of independent events. And yet the effects were devastatingly personal. Their confidence, their control, their sense of entitlement, all of it was crumbling. By evening, they were exhausted, anxious, and emotionally drained. Melissa, who had always prided herself on control and perfection, was visibly shaking with frustration. Eric, typically calm and measured, had begun doubting every decision he made. The carefully orchestrated bubble of their vacation had been punctured entirely, and now they were forced to confront their vulnerability. The second twist revealed something more profound than inconvenience or stress. It exposed the truth about their assumptions, that they had underestimated me entirely. Every dismissive laugh, every comment about burden, every small act of belittlement now came back to haunt them, not in a loud confrontation, but in the quiet, relentless unraveling of their meticulously managed world. I sat in my living room back home, quietly savoring the unfolding consequences, not with anger but with a sense of inevitability. Their stress, their panic, their frantic problem-solving, all were entirely self-contained, generated by their own responses to the precise nudges I had placed. The final layer of disruption was now in effect. They were completely unaware of the true origin of their troubles, yet entirely incapable of escaping them. The second twist had done more than I anticipated. Melissa's control-driven personality, which had always made her so confident and dismissive, was now her weakness. Eric's mediating tendencies, usually a source of calm, were now ineffectual. And the sense of helplessness that had begun with a simple email notification had transformed into a full-blown vacation crisis, one they could not easily resolve without confronting the invisible hand orchestrating it. As I closed my laptop that night, the sense of satisfaction was calm, deliberate, and absolute. The stage was fully set for the final act, the fallout reversed, where the consequences of their underestimation would manifest in their world completely and undeniably. By the sixth day of their vacation, Melissa and Eric were fully ensnared in the consequences of their own assumptions. The cascade of alerts, verifications, and flagged addresses had escalated to a point where neither of them could simply ignore the problem. What had begun as a subtle disruption, the innocuous, return address flagged notification, had snowballed into a series of crises that consumed their every thought and action. Melissa, normally composed and commanding, was a mess of stress-fueled energy. She paced their suite incessantly, muttering about incompetence and systems failing while frantically typing emails and making calls. Each phone call, each new message, seemed only to exacerbate the problem. She didn't see it yet, but every step she took played directly into the structure I had carefully built. Eric, meanwhile, tried to mediate, to calm her, to rationalize the situation, but his usual confidence had eroded. Every attempt at problem-solving was undermined by Melissa's insistence on control, and now by the unforeseen complications triggered by the automated system responses. He was exhausted, reactive, and increasingly aware that the vacation they had planned as a blissful escape had transformed into a logistical nightmare. The fallout was no longer subtle. Resort staff, airline agents, and corporate offices all became inadvertent participants in the unraveling. Melissa's insistence on escalating every minor issue made the problems worse. She demanded confirmations that triggered additional automated alerts, which in turn generated further confusion. Eric, frustrated and fatigued, realized they were spiraling beyond their control. And then came the final, irreversible piece of poetic justice. I sent one last, seemingly mundane notification, a confirmation that the flagged address had been updated, but the language was deliberately vague, hinting that additional verification might still be required. Melissa immediately interpreted it as a new crisis. She called the resort again, asked for written confirmation, and demanded assurances from the airline. By the time the evening rolled around, both of them were exhausted, anxious, and entirely consumed by the very thing they had thought was trivial enough to dismiss: me. From my perspective at home, I watched the chaos unfold with quiet satisfaction. No confrontation, no public embarrassment, just the slow, methodical unraveling of entitlement and arrogance. Melissa's obsession with control had been turned against her. Eric's attempt to protect her from the fallout had failed spectacularly. Their vacation, meant to be carefree, had become a masterclass in frustration, helplessness, and unintended consequences. The reversal was complete. For years they had acted as if I were invisible, irrelevant, a burden to be tolerated. They had laughed at me, dismissed me, and prioritized their comfort above respect or consideration. And now their world, their precious, meticulously organized world, was disrupted entirely by someone they had underestimated and undervalued. Every email, every alert, every verification call became a mirror of the disrespect they had shown me. The system that I had quietly manipulated reflected their assumptions back at them, forcing them to experience the stress, uncertainty, and helplessness they had imposed on me. By the final night of their vacation, Melissa sat slumped on the hotel couch, phone in hand, staring at a screen full of confirmations and alerts she barely understood. Eric, exhausted and defeated, simply stared out the window at the ocean, silently acknowledging the inevitability of their situation. Both had come to a realization they had not anticipated. Their assumptions about control, about their vacation, and about me had been catastrophically flawed. And in that moment, the quiet satisfaction I felt was complete. I had not yelled, confronted, or humiliated. I had simply orchestrated a scenario where their entitlement, dismissiveness, and overconfidence led to their own undoing. Their sense of security had been shattered by the very person they had labeled a burden. For the first time, they had experienced firsthand what it felt like to be underestimated, to be invisible in a way that mattered, to realize that the smallest, most unassuming person could wield control with precision and subtlety that they never imagined possible. The tables had turned, completely, inevitably, and the lesson, unspoken but undeniable, was etched into every moment of their disrupted vacation. When Eric and Melissa finally returned home, they were quiet, tense, and unusually subdued. Their vacation, which had promised sun, luxury, and carefree indulgence, had instead been dominated by confusion, stress, and the gnawing suspicion that someone had been quietly manipulating their every move. They never spoke about it in detail. Melissa was too proud, Eric too worn out, but the shift in their behavior was unmistakable. For weeks afterward, I noticed subtle changes. Melissa stopped dismissing my requests outright. She began to acknowledge the help I offered, sometimes even apologetically. Eric, too, became more attentive, more aware, more careful not to take my patience and kindness for granted. The balance of our family dynamic had quietly but irrevocably shifted. I never mentioned the notifications. I never bragged about the orchestration or the precision. It wasn't necessary. The lesson had been learned silently, effectively, and permanently. They now knew without words that I was neither invisible nor irrelevant. Sometimes, late at night, I would sit in my living room with a cup of tea, thinking about that week, about how small, subtle actions, combined with careful observation and patience, had overturned years of disregard, about how their own assumptions and entitlement had become the instruments of their undoing. And then I would smile, quietly, almost imperceptibly. Because sometimes the greatest revenge is invisible, patient, and perfect in its subtlety. They left thinking they were untouchable, but in reality, the burden they feared had been the only thing they never saw coming me.